Hey there, I'm Stan Baker, one of the hosts of Circle Forum, our podcast this week, along with Shelley Steele and Steve Young. And this week we're talking about an article entitled Teacher Wellbeing Isn't. Now, Steve, Shelley, and I have observed a lot of situations in schools where the fact that someone isn't doing well in terms of their well-being has had a huge impact on that individual, on the students, and on the staff. What I found interesting in our conversation and in this article is the distinction between burnout, which is an individual situation, and demoralization, which is much more to do with the team. Learning about well-being and its impact on me individually as a teacher or me as a restorative leader is really important because it has an impact on me, but it also has an impact on my students and on my colleagues. So if you're currently dealing with staff that are struggling with their well-being, then this podcast is for you. And we have a few very practical and simple steps that you can take. Included in this are things like getting to know your staff, finding out what their interests are, talking with them, checking in with them, making it part of your day. And then listen. At the end of this episode, you can visit our website, www.restorative.ca. You can subscribe to our podcast on YouTube, Circle Forum. Send me an email, stan@restorative.ca. Now let's tune into the conversation with Shelley, Steve, and me, Stan. We were looking at an article about teacher well-being, and the title of the article is that teacher well-being isn't. What's going on with teacher well-being? What's happening in schools with teachers?
I would think a lot of the last couple of years have been very stressful, and a lot of it has to do with COVID, obviously, and the pandemic. But it wasn't that necessary, although that adds a lot of stress to people.
We were having this discussion
Yeah,
before COVID. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
sure, exactly. And I think a lot of it, and this has been going on for years and years before COVID. You're right. A lot of it has to do with just the changing nature of how education is being done and delivered, that there are expectations on teachers that weren't there 15 and 20 years ago. There's new ways of teaching, there's new pedagogies, the use of technologies for people who aren't very tech savvy. All of a sudden, they were thrown in online teaching. Holy cow, what a learning curve. And so if you're someone who's a little bit tech phobic and all of a sudden you're teaching from home online, the stress is enormous. But you're right, Shelley, this was happening before COVID ever came along. There was a lot more being questioned or asked of teachers that wasn't probably part of what they were thinking teaching was all about when they first got into it back in 15, 20, 30 years ago, for sure. That there's more demand for accountability and communication with parents, individualization of programs, and all these things that we just weren't there. And students with a lot more challenges that we're having to work with. And yeah, there's a lot of stress, and it's led to a lot of what we'll talk about, demoralization and or burnout. And we'll talk about what those differences are because they come up in the article as well.
So what do you see as the difference between those two? Shelley, go.
I think it's important to as a leader look at those because it's really easy to clump people who are not doing well into the burnout category because that's nice. That's a term we're used to. It's a more comfortable term. That's Shelley's issue. She's burning out. Maybe I can support her with that. Maybe she needs a change. Whereas if we start to talk about demoralization, that's more of an us problem. Is that the culture of the school? Is it the leadership? Is it gets a little more complicated than it's just Shelley's work to do. And I think those are important phrases we need to think about, but also the piece around thinking about well-being is such a spectrum from well-being, I'm having a bad day today, but tomorrow I'll be okay, to the other end of the spectrum that I'm really not doing well and I'm about to leave the profession or otherwise. So we tend to just want to clump well-being together. And this, again, started before the pandemic. We were, to me, overrun with surveys and people checking in on our well-being and getting the quote of the day and the nice little thoughts coming out so that the box could be checked off on well-being. But there wasn't big shifts or changes. It was because we were starting to talk about mental health and well-being, but people were truly not understanding what that was about. for people on a
And
day-to-day basis.
so it sounds like surveys did not help your well-being. Am I
No, I think for
right?
me, and again, I have more of a background in mental health and well-being, and I just saw it was to me, I didn't see benefit to it because there wasn't anything actioned from it. And I can't imagine if you were somebody that wasn't doing well or was feeling demoralized or burnt out, that it's another survey. And what are they doing that's any different? And I've been around for 10 years now and I've seen these things. Oh, okay, now we have a little pop up on our email that gives us a nice little inspirational quote each day. That's not going to meet my needs.
So I think what I'm taking from that too is that it's not enough to just ask me these questions in a survey. You have to ask these to my face. You have to just check in with me to say, so how
Mhm.
are you doing? How are things going with, and what's happening with, and then fill in the blank. When was the last time you had a supervisor or a superintendent ask you a question about your well-being? I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah. Good
Yeah.
question.
I think, and I like the way the article breaks down the difference between burned out versus demoralized. As Shelley said, before COVID ever came along, there was a lot of demoralized teachers in teaching, just like there are demoralized nurses in it. People were not happy with the direction that public education was going in Ontario and even other parts of other jurisdictions in North America. And so for a lot of reasons, it wasn't what it was when I got into teaching in 1988. And I just don't like the way we're going ahead with all this constant evaluation and data gathering. I don't like the report cards the way they're set up, and just the demoralization with the structure of education versus burnout, which as a teacher could be. I think the way education stuff is fantastic, but COVID has just burned me out. I'm working 15, 20 hours a week more than I did before because of the online thing. I'm just mentally and physically tired. I'm burned out, but I'm not demoralized. I just need a break. So to
Right.
me, there's a real difference in that demoralized, if you're already demoralized and then you hit burnout, now you got a double whammy and it's a real problem. And no, I think those are the teachers that are leaving the profession. That COVID has just given them a convenient excuse to say, I'm getting out of education right now. They were probably demoralized.
So that demoralized or burnout could be falling into the not box that we talk about with the social discipline window. And what I really like in terms of where we're going with this conversation, because you mentioned it earlier too, Steve, expectations. Like we have had a lot of changing expectations in education recently, and those have happened because of COVID. They were happening before COVID. Now let's talk about the corresponding supports that we need. There's huge expectations, very high expectations. And I'm all for high expectations along with the support. Let's talk about the supports or lack.
Well, I guess that's the question. We can identify the problems, which you've done. So now what do we do about it? And so that's where we talk about the restorative piece and how can that restorative leadership piece and how can that play a role in changing, reversing that downward spiral of the demoralized employee or helping the burned out employee get back into the system if they've had time off or whatnot. So what's the restorative response to that? And I think the demoralized side, sometimes, as we've said so many times and so many of our, we just have to listen to them. What is it that's really gotten you so upset about education, and try to get an understanding from them. A lot of people just want to vent. They just want to vent. They're demoralized with education, but there are elements that there are still parts of the job they absolutely love. Those are the reasons they got into it. So how can we listen to them and then help them and support them to get the positives out of those things they really still like and just do the things that they need to do so they can get to the things they want to do. And so as a leader, we can do that, but we have to listen to them first.
Until we have those conversations, like, yeah, people walk around. If you haven't had a conversation, they walk around with their understanding of expectations, what's supposed to be happening. And then there's the chatter and there's the other, if people are as a group feeling like this, we know that's not a very healthy conversation that's happening. And it could be with misinformation as well. When there's an expectation there or a request there, but if it's not fitting into what needs to happen for them right now, then maybe it doesn't need to happen. Oh, okay. I don't need to do that. I can take that off my plate. But until we have an open discussion, and that might be as a group, or those may be individual conversations. Because again, the spectrum, just because I'm having a rough startup does not mean I'm feeling demoralized and I'm way at the other end of this. It might be some different levels of discussion
There
of
was
what
a
I need for my supports. Yeah. It may be a different level of discussion for what I need as support as an employee.
There was a situation that I encountered where a principal recognized, and I thought this was good on her part, that something wasn't working well. Actually, she had 7 support staff, child and youth workers, and educational assistants that were ready to kill each other.
Hmm.
And she was hoping to extend the lives of all of them. And so she asked me to come in to do a restorative circle. And what was just incredible, I still remember coming home at the end of the day of just doing some of the preparation work with these individuals, and every single one of them had like a major family or personal issue that they were dealing with outside of work. One was a husband who was palliative, another one was miscarriage, another was a special needs child, another was a divorce situation. And it was just kind of like on it, like by the 7th person I was talking to, I said, just kind of, let's just get to the story right away.
Mm.
And what was interesting was that knowing that helped the principal to start to address. Now, there were a few other things that were going on. Part of the thing that needed to happen from the principal in terms of a restorative response was that she didn't know what was going on. She didn't ask the question. She didn't listen to what was going on. And so she didn't know the context that everyone was dealing with. And she had a very, okay, you guys work it out, or why don't you go and tell the rest of the team that this is what I want them to do? Whoa, they did not take to that very well at all.
No.
So here's a good example of somebody who did recognize that there was a problem, and the response, while partially restorative, get the restorative person in here to come up with an answer, really needed to be, there's stuff you need to do. There's a part of this that you need to do and to work with. Anything else that you can think of in terms of restorative leadership addressing either burnout or demoralization? And let's just keep it simple.
I would say just make sure you have a good understanding of well-being and where you are able to support, because you're not going to be able to support it all, but there's some that you are able to support fairly easily. So get a good grasp of well-being, be open and ask the questions, and then decide where you're able to support, not decide, but understand where your limits of support may be and that other people may need to support as well.
And I think as a leader of a school, a principal, approaching working with your staff the same way we ask teachers to work with students in their classroom, a differentiated approach. What fits for one doesn't fit for another. And when we say to teachers, really get to know your kids so that you'll know student A needs this today, student B needs this today, because they're coming from a different place or they've had a bad morning or whatever, you recognize them. So you adjust your supports as necessary for different people. As a leader of a school, you need to do the same with your staff. All staff are the same. They come from different backgrounds. They have their own baggage they carry. A little thing comes along that most people are brush off, but it affects somebody else totally differently. And so you have to be aware of that. Again, we can't necessarily talk to every staff member every single day, but you got to make those efforts to get out and get to know them. And then when you do see that, the cracks starting to come from the edges, or a teacher comes to say, you need to really go and talk to so they seem to be struggling. Now you can go in and have those conversations and know that the solution or the support is going to be different for each person depending on what their individual needs are. Because we quite often, I think, we're told it's a blanket response to everything. If they do this, then they get this. That's
Call EAP, call employee assistance, when maybe they don't need that.
letter in their file.
Yeah.
Just put a letter in their file. Well, for some people, they just laugh it up. Other people, that would put them right over the edge.
Yes.
You
Yes.
can know them.
One other thing that I think of is just find out what shared interests you have with those individual teachers. Maybe you have a shared love of movies, or you're really into Star Wars, or you like to follow hockey, or Any examples of where you found those kinds of connections with others that you worked with? Because you don't need to be the leader in the building to do that. Any examples of people you connected with that you had a shared interest with?
Gosh, I'm sure.
Years,
Yeah.
years.
Come on, just a
Come-
simple answer to a simple
Well, recently travel
yeah.
for me, right?
Yeah.
Where it's- when especially if you're entering into something new, then all of a sudden things and open up that you find people have experiences and things to talk about. Or my husband's just started beekeeping. There's a whole world of beekeepers out there that we didn't know about that are very eager to share what they want to know.
Hey,
So,
my son is a beekeeper.
Really?
Maybe they should get
Yeah.
together. He just used his extractor just this past weekend
Ooh,
and got all kinds
Yeah.
of honey out there. So there's an example, right?
Yeah.
Travel. Any other things that you could think of in terms of interests where you've picked up interests with others? Go.
You gain interest in terms of cheering for the same hockey team or joining
Yeah.
a hockey pool or things like that. Your teachers come and say, hey, we should have a hockey jersey day because they know that you like hockey or a football or whatever it is. So you get to know those teachers that like those things. So you become part of that, almost a social group. You go to the staff room to check the scores, who's leading in the pool today. Fun little things that you do that you become part of the staff in terms of those things. You're just another name on the list. We always talked about socializing with your staff as administrators. If everybody's going for a drink on a Friday after school, you can go with them, but don't stay to the end. You should be the first one to leave, not the last. But the fact that you even go out to have that casual social time and to talk about anything except school. So that's where you talk about your travel or your beekeeping or your hobbies and all those things. So you can get to know your staff on a social, personal level, as opposed to always being that administrator.
There's a great drinking game that goes with that. And that is that if when you're getting together with a whole group of people, you mention school, you have to take a drink. So you have to not talk about school. It has to be anything but school. That's just an aside. We're not encouraging people to do drinking games. It could be take another bite of a special pie, but that's another thing. Food is something that people love to talk about and connect over. And favorite restaurants, go into a staff room and talk about food. Building those kinds of connections. Pets is another one. If you have a dog, or if you like horseback riding, or if you have a fish, or if you have exotic pets, or play a musical instrument, like it's other hobbies and interests that you have that others might have. I love reading mystery books and murder mystery books, and maybe here's a great one that you could read. And it's finding those things out about your colleagues. You don't need to be the principal to do this. Find that out about your colleagues, and then you'll really start to build those connections.
You just said something that was pretty important, and that was go into the staff room. And as administrators, and even for other teachers, go into the staff room. Staff rooms are pretty deserted these days. And with COVID, we had to. But even before that, you go to the staff room, maybe a third of the staff would come to the staff room to eat lunch. The rest would just find some would have their own 3 or 4 or 5 people would meet in somebody's room and eat lunch there. We always talk about staff room A, staff room B, staff room C, and people would find their own little places. But I would, as a leader, make sure I got to all of those places. And I would sit in the staff room at lunchtime and people would say, "You're not eating your lunch?" "Oh, I already ate my lunch." "What are you doing here?" "I'm just hanging out." You just talk, you get to know people, and that's what you do. And teachers will do that too. They'll just start to hang out in the staff room because it's the social time and it's a bit of a downtime, obviously. But then we do those food things like snacks on Thursdays or Fridays or whenever and everybody shows up in the staff room in those days. And that's where you can really start to build some social capital.
I wanted to talk a little bit about appreciation. And other than me just saying right now, Steve, I really appreciate you. And Shelley, I really appreciate you. When was
Thanks,
the
Tim.
last time, when was the last time somebody expressed some appreciation in your work setting? And how did that make you feel?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because we're not socialized to accept appreciation and compliments very well. And actually, that's some of the early work in restorative practices is to have little people be able to just say thank you, or when something's been shared with them. And that's a real social skill. And it's something I've worked on, because oh no, that couldn't possibly, I haven't done that. That's what we're used to, saying those kind of things. So it is a skill to just say thank you and receive it. So it is interesting, and it is something we need to get better at, both sharing and receiving.
I go into schools now to fill in for short terms, and it's always nice to hear that people want you to stay or to come back. And I think it's more than just simply, hey, if you leave, we haven't got anybody. Once you built up a bit of a relationship with the staff that you're working with after 2, 3, 4 months, wherever, however long I'm there, and they say, really, we really like you to come back in September. No, you hear it from the kids too. I don't know how many times I can even probably lost count how many kids say, you're the best principal we've ever had. I've only been here a day. I appreciate that. And you say thank you and you move on. But kids will say that to you, and you do build up those connections with parents over time, and they want you to stay. Knowing that I'm only there for a short time, you tend to get a lot more of those compliments and people wanting you to stay back. So it's always nice. When I was working full time, you get the odd parent would say things towards the end of a school year. They thank you for all you did for their children that year, or whatever. They'd say it with gifts at Christmas time, for sure. A lot of people feel obligated to give gifts to the kids' teachers, but it's amazing how many I got as a principal from parents that I might have dealt with once or twice, or I've dealt with their kids a few times, and the kids would say, we got to give Mr. Young a present. He's been putting up with me in the office. You do get those little appreciations along the way, but as Sally says, we don't say thank you very much. Just go out into society. People don't say, they don't say thank you or you're welcome. They say, sure, whatever. They feel, I know it's funny when you say thank you to them, they go, oh, you're welcome. They won't say you're welcome. They'll say, no problem. And people even want to say you're welcome anymore. But it is interesting. Getting compliments for doing the job that we're supposed to be doing anyway is always a bit tough to accept, but it's nice.
And here's that symmetry, right? Like, we do this with kids, and we expect people who interact with kids to appreciate and to affirm and to say thank you for things that students do. And to me, a part of restorative leadership is doing that with the adults too. That if you catch somebody being good, you've never heard that. You catch a student being, what if you catch an adult being good? It's a shift in your mind to go and look for the things that you can say thank you for. Hey, I noticed, just even to say that. Yeah, I noticed that you took care of the other class while the teacher had to go and have a bathroom break. Thanks.
Thanks. It needs to be authentic. I will add that, because if you're walking around just laying that on everywhere, then people are like that. Oh, he's just schmoozing. He's just the used car salesman, or she's. So it really needs to be authentic.
Thanks for saying that, Shelley.
Thank you for being you.
Thank you.
Just like kids, adults sniff that out really quickly.
Sure.
Yeah, and I agree. Because we do notice these things, we just don't always acknowledge them in people. So take the time to do that.
The thing that I think about teacher well-being, and that's where we started, is that it is a huge deal. And it is so big that it almost becomes overwhelming, and we don't want to step in. And what I think we need to encourage each other in as leaders is to wade in, but to just take the little piece that you can. Just do the little thing. Like, you don't have to fix this person's problems. Maybe you just have to listen. Maybe you just have to go alongside. Maybe you have to come up with a shared interest. But there are little things that you can do to make a difference in how somebody's feeling in terms of being demoralized or not, or burned out or not. And wouldn't it be great if people could catch that before prevent it, rather than putting out the fire or having to get a supply teacher in, or a supply principal in, or a supply secretary in? What if we could catch those things beforehand? That would be amazing.
It would.
Well-being is on everyone's mind, and for good reason, especially with teacher well-being and the impact that it has on schools. If you'd like to find out more about restorative practices and how that can impact positively well-being at your school, send me an email to stan@restorative.ca. Check out our resources, www.restorative.ca, and let's make simple well-being conversations a part of every day at school.